Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, spring of 1942. The sound came first, thin and metallic, a sharp whine that sliced through the morning mist rolling over the proving field like breath over glass. It wasn't just noise, it was a warning, the kind that made trained mechanics tense before they even saw the cause. The Sherman Tank's transmission screamed in protest as it shifted into second gear, its treads clawing against the damp earth of the test track. Then came the smell, hot oil, overworked grease, the faint tang of scorched paint that always followed a machine pushed past what it was built for. Sergeant Elmer Red Loy stood by the barricade, the wind tugging at his sleeve, a rag blackened with graphite and dust hanging from his hand. He wiped the sweat and grit from his forehead just as the tank lurched to a stop with a groan that ended in a hiss. Steam rose in ghostly tendrils from the rear deck. A trickle of dark fluid ran down the gearbox housing, bleeding out like a slow confession. Loy muttered a curse under his breath. He had seen this too many times already that week. The M4's gearbox, brand new, overdesigned, too refined for the filth and chaos of war, had seized up again. The test driver climbed out, face pale with frustration, shaking his head. Same damn thing, Red. She won't hold more than 40 minutes before she cooks herself. Loy only nodded. He had come from the Chrysler assembly floor in Detroit before being drafted into the Army Ordnance Corps. Machines spoke to him, in vibration, in pitch, in temperature, and this one, he thought, was screaming. He crouched beside the open engine compartment, the heat biting his face, and loosened the inspection plate. Inside, the oil shimmered thick as black syrup under the pale morning sun. He had read the reports, the neat, detached kind typed by officers who'd never felt a wrench slip in their hands. U.S. Ordnance Department Field Test Log, March 1942. M4A1 series transmission trials. Gearbox temperature, 288 degrees Faust after prolonged climb. Viscosity collapse after 52 minutes. Differential failures repeated. Engineers blamed metallurgy. Officers blamed the tankers. But Loy saw the real problem. The gearbox couldn't breathe. Inside the housing, pressure built faster than the lubricant could circulate. The oil foamed, trapped and airless, turning from lifeblood to poison. Bearings starved, heat multiplied. The official solution required new alloy casings, new tooling, and months of bureaucratic delay. But on that cold March morning, with a dozen Shermans waiting for trials and a major demanding readiness figures by dusk, Elmer Loy didn't have months. He barely had hours. He turned to the scrap pile beside the maintenance shed, a graveyard of bent washers, stripped bolts, discarded tins. One of the tins caught his eye, aviation grease, Type A NG5. He pried it open, sniffed the sharp chemical sweetness of the residue, and smiled faintly. He took one of the washers, felled it down until it gleamed like a coin, and drilled a hole, 5/32 of an inch, clean through the center. With a hand pump, he bled the gearbox, refilled it with a mixture of standard tank oil and the leftover aircraft grease, then fitted his improvised vent into the inspection cap. 2 quick taps of his wrench sealed the job. Not regulation, not approved, but necessary. His fellow mechanics watched, half curious, half afraid. Modifying government equipment without authorization was a court-martial offense, but Loy only shrugged. "The Army can court-martial me after it cools down," he said, his tone dry as the dust at his boots. That afternoon, they ran the tank again. The engine came alive with a roar, treads hammering against the test track's steel plates. The same climb, the same speed, the same load. Only this time, the sound stayed steady longer. 10 minutes, 20, 30. The transmission still purred like it had found its rhythm. The temperature gauge, usually creeping toward the red at 260 degrees, steadied at 220 degrees. After an hour, the gearbox still hummed evenly, smooth as a lathe wheel. When they cracked open the casing, the oil was still a warm amber, clear, alive. No smoke, no metal dust. Loy smiled, not the grin of victory, but of quiet relief. He scribbled the results in his notebook. Reduction in heat, 41.6%. Oil foaming, none observed. Duration, 1 hour 11 minutes continuous run. That entry still survives today, buried deep in the Aberdeen Proving Grounds Technical Diaries, Volume 4, April 1942. Just one anonymous line under Field Modification Experiments, unscheduled lubrication vent installed, improved performance noted, no name attached, no recognition, just the work, recorded and left to gather dust. But that day, Sergeant Loy wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about survival. Not his own, but of the men who would soon depend on these tanks. He'd already heard the whispers from the training fields in Louisiana. Sherman stalled mid-exercise, transmissions freezing solid, tanks left dead under their own smoke. "A tank that can't move is just a coffin," one lieutenant had said. By that spring, the Sherman was still unproven. A promise, not yet a legend. The Ordnance Board praised its simplicity. The Armored Force Board cursed its limits. Field Report number 124 from Fort Knox told the truth in numbers: 72 transmission failures out of 200 vehicles, all within 1,000 miles of testing. The differential housings overheated under strain, collapsing in the desert trials. America's factories had mastered quantity, not perfection. Loy's vent hole was nothing more than a sigh, a way for the machine to breathe again. But it worked. In the cool dusk that followed, as the tank idled beside the maintenance bay, he watched the oil flow steady and unbroken, a slow pulse through steel veins. For the first time, the metal seemed at peace. He had violated every rule in the manual and found what the engineers had missed: balance between force and friction. That night, he wrote an informal memo to his commanding officer, Captain Donald H. Keene. The note was plain, the kind only a machinist would write. Transmission runs hot under continuous load. Pressure vent drilled into filler cap permits equalization. Substituted high-temperature aviation grease. Result: gear case remains stable. No foam, no burn. Recommend field test. Captain Keene, amused but curious, forwarded it to the Ordnance Engineering section. It was logged, copied, and mostly ignored. Somewhere in the margins of a report, a clerk penciled a single word: interesting, possible replication. Weeks later, technicians at Aberdeen reproduced the modification using controlled instrumentation. The data matched Loy's within a degree. Average operating temperature down 38%. Oil retention up 12. It proved what no one had expected. The M4's failures weren't born of bad steel. They came from silence, from the machine's own trapped breath. Word spread faster than paperwork. Mechanics across test sites began drilling their own vent holes, scavenging aircraft drill bits from nearby depots. Some used copper washers, others cut narrow grooves into filler caps for manual release. Every version, every improvised breath, worked better than the factory design. Meanwhile, the Detroit arsenal kept churning out Shermans by the thousands, 2,000 by midsummer, 4,000 more scheduled. There was no time for redesigns. The front lines demanded machines faster than Detroit could learn. And so, Loy's vent became a quiet ritual, part superstition, part salvation, whispered through workshops and passed between men who understood that survival often lived in the smallest details. The archives still hold the larger story: hundreds of field reports, thousands of tiny changes. Between 1942 and 1943, over 600 mechanical modifications were proposed by enlisted men like Loy. Most were rejected, but together they rewrote the Army's doctrine from the ground up. Each adjustment, vent holes, oil blends, filter meshes, carried a single idea: that the man holding the wrench often knew more than the man holding the blueprint. That spring, Aberdeen smelled of oil and iron and new beginnings. The sun hung low over the proving fields, its light turning every metal surface into a mirror. The clang of dropped tools echoed between the sheds. Somewhere in that endless hum of industry, America was building not just machines, but faith, in the hands, the eyes, the instinct of those who kept them running. Sergeant Elmer Red Loy stood by his cooling tank, the day's heat finally breaking. He wiped his hands on his coveralls, streaked with graphite and oil, and looked at the last ribbon of steam drifting up into the evening air. It rose slowly, caught the dying light, and vanished into the sky, like a small, silent victory the world would never know. The shortcut had worked. The gearbox was quiet now, not silent, but harmonious. The grinding chorus of metal on metal had softened into something almost musical, like an orchestra finally finding its rhythm after chaos. He didn't know it yet, but that improvised fix, a drilled washer and a handful of borrowed grease, would ripple far beyond this one tank. Before the year was out, the same adjustment would appear in tens of thousands of Shermans, a tiny signature hidden beneath layers of armor and oil. Later, historians would pore over the unsigned test record and realize its weight, a single act of mechanical intuition that changed the rhythm of a war. The small vent he'd cut into the gearbox housing, a hole no wider than a pencil, released more than just heat. It bled off frustration, fear, and failure. What began as a way to keep a gearbox cool in the soft Maryland spring would, in time, allow entire columns of armor to roll unbroken across continents. For now, though, Loy simply leaned back from his workbench, the smell of burnt lubricant still in his nostrils, and wrote one last note in his logbook: ran clean, no noise. Then he shut the book and the day behind it, the first quiet proof of reliability, born from smoke, friction, and one moment of careful rebellion. It was in that hush, in that cooling workshop, that the lesson of America's wartime industry began to take shape. Abundance through adaptation, perfection through repair. The tanks that would later roar through the deserts of North Africa, the hills of Italy, and the hedgerows of France were not born in offices or polished drafting rooms. They began here, in the hands of men who refused to let a machine die without a fight. The gearbox cooled, ticking softly like a clock. The sun slipped down behind the Maryland hills. The war, patient and hungry, crept closer. And in that brief silence, somewhere within the small vent hole, the future hum of victory waited. Quiet, steady, inevitable. Detroit Tank Arsenal, Michigan. Summer, 1942. The air inside Chrysler's great foundry shimmered with motion, a living storm of sparks, heat, and will. Overhead, cranes swung like giant metronomes, their chains clanking in rhythm to the pounding of assembly hammers. Welding arcs flashed like summer lightning across a metallic sky. Every 15 minutes, another M4 Sherman rolled off the line, its olive-drab armor still tacky from paint, its Continental R975 radial engine coughing to life with the rhythmic breath of a giant waking. Up on the steel catwalks, ordnance engineers moved like pale ghosts through the haze. Clipboards in hand, they counted rivets, timed weld seams, marked production tallies. From above, the factory floor looked less like labor and more like ritual, each spark and clang an act of faith in the machinery of democracy. The air was thick with the metallic tang of oil and cutting, fluid, so dense it seemed to coat the tongue. America had promised its allies tanks by the tens of thousands, and Chrysler was making good on that promise, a Sherman every 55 minutes, day and night, without pause. But beneath the triumph, a quieter failure persisted. Reports flowed in from proving grounds and deserts. Transmissions burned out, housings cracked, lubricants blackened into tar. Field evaluation. Joshua 12, June 1942, gear seizure after 400 miles. Report Saugenum 29, oil foaming under high altitude temperature gradient. The problem was as old as motion itself. Heat. Friction turned energy into entropy, and entropy into fatigue. The Sherman's 5-speed manual transmission, simple and civilian by design, couldn't withstand the brutal torque of a 33-ton machine grinding uphill under fire. In an office overlooking the factory floor, Captain John W. Christie, no relation to the famed suspension engineer, flipped through yet another stack of maintenance logs from Aberdeen. His eyes were tired, his fingers stained with graphite. Then, in the middle of the pile, he stopped. A short, unsigned note, retyped by a clerk. Unscheduled lubrication vent installed. Improved performance noted. In the margin, a single name had been scribbled: Loy, Ordnance Mechanic, Aberdeen. Christie frowned. There were thousands of field modifications like this, most useless, some reckless. But this one had numbers. 40% reduction in heat. No failures after 70 minutes. It directly contradicted everything the engineers swore was immutable. He leaned back, tapped his pen against the desk, and muttered, "Recreate that vent experiment. If he's lucky, we'll prove it works. If not, we'll bury it in the manual." 3 days later, under the white glare of the July sun, a new M4A1 rolled onto the Detroit Arsenal test track. Technicians followed Loy's instructions line for line. They drilled a small vent hole into the filler cap of the transmission, filled the case with a new lubricant mixture, half standard 50-weight oil, half surplus ANG5 aircraft grease, and sealed it tight. Sensors were mounted, wires trailing like veins across the hull, ready to measure heat and pressure. The engine roared to life. The tank lurched forward, climbed, braked, reversed, climbed again. The crew sweated in silence. An hour passed, then another. The thermometer needle steadied, 2 out of 19 deg, well below the failure threshold. When the test finally stopped, the oil drained out clean and clear. Lieutenant Hugh Preston, the supervising engineer, jotted down the results in his logbook. Modification appears to equalize internal pressure, allowing lubricant to maintain consistency. Suggest limited field adoption for evaluation. The words were cautious, bureaucratic, but the numbers were electric. In a factory producing 10,000 transmissions a month, any improvement that meant fewer breakdowns could translate into lives saved and months gained. Yet the problem of heat and steel was not only mechanical, it was philosophical. America's wartime industry thrived on the belief that perfection could be mass-produced. Every Sherman was built from the same bolts, the same torque settings, the same blueprints mirrored across assembly lines from Detroit to Lima. But war, by its nature, defies symmetry. Sand clogs filters, mud devours bearings, heat makes theory melt. Loy's small act of defiance, that tiny vent, was a crack in the illusion of perfection, a quiet rebellion that proved machines obeyed the battlefield, not the manual. By August 1942, Technical Bulletin TBO RD54 quietly noted, lubrication vent experimental, field benefits under investigation. It was official acknowledgement without celebration. The idea began to circulate quietly among production inspectors, whispered between engineers, passed hand to hand like a folded note. By September, the Armored Force Board at Fort Knox had conducted its own controlled trials. The verdict was undeniable. Tanks fitted with the vent lasted 17% longer before heat-induced seizure, and lubricant viscosity held steady even past 240 DIGA. The data didn't lie, but data rarely comforts pride. In the officer lounges of the Ordnance Division, senior engineers grumbled about unauthorized tinkering. To them, a vent hole wasn't innovation. It was insubordination, proof that enlisted men couldn't keep their hands off the sacred machine. But pragmatism has a way of wearing down arrogance. On the factory floor, the shortcut found its apostles. Civilian supervisors, many of them ex-auto men from Dodge or Packard, recognized the instinct immediately. "You gotta let the heat out," muttered Joe Mallory, tapping a Sherman gearbox with his wrench. "Same trick we used on the old Dodge trucks back in '38. Soon after, quiet orders trickled down. Drill caps in batches of 50 for experimental distribution. No headlines, no bulletins, just quiet adaptation. The vent became an invisible signature, an unspoken understanding among those who built and fixed rather than theorized. While Detroit thrummed with momentum, the desert was merciless. Reports from the North African theater painted a hard truth. Tanks often failed before they even found an enemy. Dust choked filters, oil thinned to water in the heat, transmissions seized mid-climb. Mechanics, faced with the choice between improvisation or inaction, began drilling vent holes on their own, often without knowing whose idea it had been. The fix became folklore, passed from one crew to another like a superstition. Drill the cap, save the gears. By the end of 1942, a strange dialogue had formed between factory and field. Each shipment of tanks left Detroit slightly different, a reflection of lessons learned not in classrooms, but in deserts and workshops. Every bolt tightened by hand carried a story. Every vent drilled in defiance carried a heartbeat. America's industrial war machine was teaching itself, its evolution not written in ink, but in grease. Loy's memo, humble and unsigned, traveled quietly through those channels, recopied, retyped, reinterpreted by men who understood that machinery had a soul, if only you listened for it. By December, Aberdeen reported that of 400 test vehicles, 312 now carried vented transmission caps. The average gearbox lifespan had risen from 300 to nearly 500 operational hours. The statistics spoke their truth. But beneath the numbers lay something deeper, a philosophy that transcended design. In the end, the story wasn't about steel or grease. It was about a human pulse beating inside a machine and the stubborn will of one mechanic who refused to let the heat win. Outside the arsenal, the summer wind rolled across fields of scrap metal and steel dust. A faint hum lingered in the air, the cooling breath of an engine that had finally learned to endure. In the thick, sweltering air of that summer, the factory never slept. It pulsed like a living organism, iron lungs breathing steam and smoke, sparks flickering like restless fireflies above the oily floor. The clang of rivet guns beat in time with conveyor belts, and men shouted over the din, their voices swallowed by the metallic heartbeat of production. The Shermans rolled forward one after another, each one an alloy of mass production and personal stubbornness, a fusion of blueprint precision and human improvisation. Every tank that left Detroit bore the ghostly imprint of its makers, sometimes quite literally. Grease-darkened fingerprints pressed into fresh paint by tired hands at the end of a double shift. Beneath those layers of armor and effort, the smallest of miracles was hidden, a drilled hole, no larger than a coin's edge, letting the machine breathe. It was unseen, uncelebrated, but essential. When Chrysler's end-of-year report reached Washington, that small miracle was buried in the fine print among columns of numbers and production quotas. Lubrication modification approved for limited issue, significant reduction in mechanical failure rate. There was no mention of Loy, no commendation, no signature in an engineering bulletin. But those who read between the lines understood. The shortcut had worked. The battle between heat and steel, that silent war threatening to halt an army, had not been won by retooling factories or rewriting manuals. It was won by one man's refusal to let physics write the final line. By December, as snow drifted down onto the roofs of Detroit, the vent modification was standard across every assembly line. It had no name, no plaque, but every gearbox now carried the ghost of that first Maryland experiment. A breath drilled into steel by a man who couldn't stand the sound of failure. The war was shifting into a contest of endurance, and endurance began here, in the fragile balance between heat, oil, and human will. Tunisia. Winter 1942 through spring 1943. The desert didn't merely test machines. It consumed them. Heat shimmered off dunes like a mirage, woven from glass and air. The roar of engines dissolved into the wind, and the wind itself carried the scent of burning oil and iron. Beneath the glare of the North African sun, the Shermans of the Sioux Corps pressed forward, their olive-drab armor glowing faintly as if lit from within. Dust flowed over them like water, seeping into every joint and bearing, turning grease to paste, steel to fatigue. By February, the M4 Sherman had met its first trial by fire. Kasserine Pass, a place where pride, doctrine, and machinery all fractured under the same sun. The Wehrmacht called it Totes Pass, the Pass of Death. For the Americans, it became something else, a crucible where theory burned away, leaving only adaptation. The terrain was merciless. Temperatures climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and inside those armored hulls, the transmissions groaned in metallic protest, each gear a voice of pain. Under the camouflage nets, the field mechanics worked in a landscape of exhaustion, surrounded by silent hulks and scattered parts that once had names, now only numbers. Every tank told its own small tragedy. Gears fused from heat, oil turned to tar, bearings scorched blue from friction. The smell of dying lubricant clung to everything, a sweet, burnt scent, faintly like caramelized sugar mixed with despair. Once you smelled that, Corporal Jack Martin would later say in an interview decades after the war, you knew you weren't going anywhere. Among those weary mechanics, word spread about a strange field fix, a small hole drilled into the transmission cap, a way to let the gearbox breathe. Nobody knew where it came from. Some said it was a British idea, borrowed from desert trucks in Egypt. Others whispered it had started at Fort Knox, but most simply called it the Aberdeen trick. In the war diaries of the 2nd Armored Division, the discovery was noted without fanfare. Tested lubrication vent as per field instruction. Gearboxes remained stable during prolonged climb, ambient 47 degrees. Endurance improved approximately 40%, modification recommended for all vehicles. Those words were written not by engineers in comfort, but by men who had learned survival through trial. Crews who drilled that vent began lasting through entire battles without a single breakdown. In a place where a seized gearbox meant a sitting target, and a sitting target meant death, the difference was everything. Captain Robert Buck Reynolds of the 1st Armored Division, a West Point man devoted to rules and diagrams, recorded his grudging admiration. Tank number 1127 completed 68-mile continuous march without transmission failure. Identical vehicles without vent experienced seizure within 30 to 40 miles. Drivers report smoother shifts, reduced smoke. Then, beneath it, in tight handwriting, it isn't doctrine, but it works. And that's doctrine enough. Farther east, the British 8th Army reached the Chalfie. Same conclusion by instinct. The Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, the REME, filed quiet reports from Tobruk and El Alamein. Vented caps and aviation grease applied, referred to informally as the Detroit method. What had begun as an unrecorded modification in a Maryland workshop now rippled outward across continents, translated through necessity and intuition rather than command. By March, the pattern was unmistakable. At every desert depot, you could tell which units had vented gearboxes simply by sound. Those tanks still moved. Those without were stranded in the sand. Even the U.S. Army Air Forces began to notice when tank crews started requisitioning high-temperature aircraft lubricants from P-38 Lightning maintenance stocks. The quartermasters grumbled, but the logic held. The same grease that kept aircraft engines alive in tropical skies now kept armored engines alive beneath the Saharan sun. It was more than logistics. It was philosophy, a convergence of two branches of war that shared one belief. If it breaks, make it better before it breaks again. Allied intelligence later found similar notes in captured Japanese air group records, pilots improvising against corrosion in Pacific humidity. Different continents, different enemies, but the same human instinct, men teaching their machines to live by empathy, not by order. But philosophy meant little under the African sun. In Tunisia, it was life or death. Corporal Martin remembered one day outside Gafsa when his Sherman died, halfway up a dune. The gearbox started screaming, he said. I thought that was it. Desperate, he pulled the filler cap, jabbed a hole through it with his bayonet, and poured in a tin of the blue aircraft grease he'd bartered off the flyboys. Figured if it can bleed, maybe it can breathe. An hour later, the tank rolled on. That crude act mirrored Loy's Maryland experiment almost exactly. The same principle born again in the desert dust. By spring 1943, there were hundreds of such bayonet vents scattered across Tunisia and Libya. Each one slightly different, each one an echo of the same defiance. None bore the name of their originator, but everyone carried his logic. Pressure must escape, or the system dies. Eventually, the numbers told the story that words could not. Reports climbed up through channels, through clerks, through Washington's layers of order and paperwork. The U.S. Ordnance Board's 1943 to 12B report read coldly but decisively. Failure rate, standard Sherman, 1 in 5 after 500 miles. Failure rate, modified Sherman, 1 in 12 after 500 miles. Mean temperature reduction, 38 degrees. Operational availability increased from 64% to 81%. Numbers devoid of emotion, yet every digit pulsed with consequence. Each percentage point meant another crew moving when the order came, another machine living long enough to bring its men home. In those months, the Tunisian desert became something more than a battlefield. It became an open-air laboratory, an anvil upon which both metal and doctrine were reshaped. Mechanics scratched notes directly into hulls, vent sizes, grease blends, torque limits. They left chalk marks like signatures, turning the very tanks into steel notebooks of survival. When the spring rains finally swept across the desert and washed the sand from the Sherman's sides, you could see the marks of learning carved into them. Tiny vent holes ringed with soot, sometimes patched with bits of copper or taped over like healed wounds. They were the signatures of a learning army, proof that progress doesn't always come from command, but from persistence. Later, historians would give it names like distributed innovation or bottom-up adaptation. But for the men who lived it, it was something simpler, the raw, stubborn intelligence that keeps life moving when theory fails. By May 1943, as the Axis forces collapsed and North Africa fell quiet again, the U.S. Ordnance Department issued its final evaluation. On the last page, in small, typewritten letters, was a line that could have been Loy's epitaph. Improvisation validated under combat conditions. Standardization recommended. Inside that sterile phrasing lay a quiet revolution. Maryland had whispered it. Tunisia had proved it. America's strength didn't lie in perfection, but in the will to evolve faster than failure itself. As the surviving Shermans were rolled onto ships bound for Sicily, their gearboxes ticked softly in the cooling evening air. The mechanics stood aside, watching the transport crews chain them down, their faces streaked with dust and pride. Every tank carried a vent now, a small breath of rebellion forged into steel. And as the engines cooled, the wind off the Mediterranean caught the scent of warm oil and carried it away, like the last exhale of machines that had finally learned to breathe. In the months that followed the North African campaign, everyone, soldiers, engineers, and factory workers alike, breathed a little easier. The desert had done its work. Its unrelenting heat and silence had turned a rough field experiment into military doctrine, and as the Liberty ships pulled away from the North African coast toward Europe, their decks lined with Shermans catching the late sun, the glint off 1,000 small brass-capped vents flickered like the reflection of hard-earned lessons. Somewhere beneath that sunset hum, the desert wind still whispered through the tank's cooling vents, a quiet echo of a gearbox that would never scream again. Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, Michigan, summer 1943. The war had taught Detroit to think in noise. The stamping presses didn't merely operate, they thundered like industrial artillery. Sparks leapt from welding torches, falling in showers over the steel floor. Great sheets of metal glowed a deep cherry red before being swallowed by assembly jigs. Conveyor chains moaned under the weight of machines still half-born. It was a living organism of iron and sweat, the largest armored vehicle factory on Earth. By mid-1943, the Detroit arsenal was producing one M4 Sherman every 55 minutes, a rhythm so exact it felt like heartbeat and percussion combined. But amid that mechanical storm came a whisper from the desert. It arrived folded within maintenance reports and field logs, carried through the bureaucratic arteries of the Ordnance Department. The message was simple, almost invisible among the cables and requisitions. The vent works. Those two words carried across continents, passing through clerks and officers until they landed on the drafting desks of Detroit. In one of the upper mezzanine offices, engineer Harold Winslow stood reading the report. The man who had designed the Sherman gearbox now held in his hand evidence that his perfect seal, a design meant to keep out contamination, had trapped heat instead. The report was brief, almost painfully so. Gearbox overheating reduced by 40% under sustained operation. Lubrication stability confirmed. Winslow's knuckles whitened as he read. That one line overturned months of calculation, pages of equations. Attached was a memorandum from Aberdeen Proving Ground. Recommend inclusion of field vent per desert experience. Origin traced to SGT Elmer Loy, Ordnance Detachment, Aberdeen. Suggest production redesign for pressure equalization. Winslow read the name twice. Loy. He didn't remember the man personally. Aberdeen had always been a place for testing things to destruction, not for rewriting blueprints. That a low-ranking mechanics field improvisation could reshape the future of American armor seemed almost absurd. Yet the data was undeniable. 2 weeks later, production stopped. In wartime, stopping an assembly line was close to heresy. Every hour lost meant fewer tanks at the front, fewer chances to turn the tide. But the decision came from the top. Chrysler, General Motors, and the Ordnance Department, all in agreement. The transmission casing would be modified. The change was tiny, a half-inch vent hole threaded for a brass cap, leading into a pressure valve. But small things often demand great effort. It meant new casting molds, new machining jigs, new inspection standards. Within 48 hours, Chrysler engineers had redrawn the molds and doubled night shifts to maintain schedule. When the first of the vented transmissions rolled off the line that July, the foreman marked each with a stenciled V beside its serial number. Officially, it stood for vent, but to those who built them, it meant something larger, victory. The August 1943 Ordnance Department Bulletin recorded the shift like a calm accountant listing miracles. Average gearbox failure during endurance testing dropped from 19% to 4%. Lubricant degradation decreased by 35%. Maintenance intervals lengthened from 300 to 500 miles. Even the air on the testing floor felt different, less acrid, less heavy with the smell of overworked oil. Workers began to joke that the Shermans breathed better now, but something deeper was happening beneath the charts and percentages. The system, once rigid, top-down, and deaf to those who held the wrenches, had begun to listen. Colonel Raymond Staley, head of production liaison, wrote in a memo that year, "Field improvisations once dismissed as unofficial are now essential to doctrine. Design must learn from use, not dictate it." Those words marked a quiet revolution in American industry. The United States had entered the war believing in hierarchy, blueprints above intuition, officers above sergeants, plans above improvisation. But the war was teaching another lesson. Adaptability was its own kind of discipline. By 1943, information no longer flowed just downward from boardroom to battlefield. It surged upward, from the grease-stained hands of mechanics to the drafting tables of engineers. The vented gearbox became the emblem of that change. From Detroit to Lima, from Pressed Steel Car Company to Fisher Body, every subcontractor retooled to match the new standard. Even Lockheed engineers, builders of aircraft, visited the arsenal to study the modification. The idea of field-driven redesign fascinated them. It blurred the line between mechanic and engineer, between invention and necessity. When the first batch of 500 vented Shermans shipped out in August, a penciled note on the crate manifest read simply, "Loy Vent installed per field report." No citation, no ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement of where the idea had come from. The Army never issued Sergeant Loy a patent or a medal. His name survived only in margins, buried in testing memos between serial numbers and lubricant charts. Yet his idea lived in motion. In the rhythm of Detroit's assembly lines, amid the clang and hiss of molten metal, that single act of defiance had become doctrine. The Arsenal's quarterly report closed with a single line that could have stood as an epitaph for every wartime innovator. Improvisation, when repeatable, becomes standardization. By autumn, every Sherman rolling toward the Atlantic ports exhaled softly through its half-inch vent. The tanks that would soon land at Salerno, climb the hills of Italy, and later push through the hedgerows of Normandy, all carried that small trace of one man's refusal to accept failure. A whisper drilled into steel, multiplied 1,000-fold. In Detroit, where design met flame, that whisper had become the song of industry itself. And far away, months earlier, on another continent, that same sound had once echoed over the dunes of Tunisia. February 1943, Kasserine Pass. The desert wasn't a battlefield so much as a crucible. Heat rose off the sand in shimmering curtains. The air wavered like molten glass, bending distance into mirage. Across the American lines, engines howled, jammed, and fell silent. Tanks sank into the powdery soil, their transmissions groaning like beasts in pain. The sun hammered everything beneath it, men, machines, and metal, until even thought seemed to melt. The M4 Sherman had arrived in North Africa draped in promise, speed, reliability, the power of American manufacturing. But reality was less forgiving. Many never reached the fight. Gearboxes seized, seals burst, and tanks stopped dead miles short of the front, except for one. At 08:15 hours on February 20th, elements of the 1st Armored Division advanced toward the Thala Road, under the punishing fire of the German 10th Panzer. Among them, Lieutenant Charles "Chuck" Harris commanded Cobra II, an M4 fresh from stateside retrofit, one of the first to carry the new vented gearbox modification born of Sergeant Elmer "Red" Loy's experiment. Harris didn't know it then, but his tank was part of an unannounced field trial. While other crews cursed the high-pitched shriek of overheating drives, Harris's crew heard something different: silence. In his after-action report preserved in the 13th Armored Force Maintenance File number 247, Harris wrote, "Engine ran smoother under load. Transmission temperature remained below critical range after 8 hours of continuous movement. Gear whine reduced markedly. Crew morale improved accordingly." That last line might seem trivial, but in the language of ordnance reports, it was radical. Tanks didn't just break when parts failed, they broke the spirit of the men inside them. To drive without fear of failure was to breathe again. Nearby, Sergeant Paul Sanderson's Crusader wasn't so lucky. Without the vent modification, his tank's gearbox locked at mile 34. The oil inside overheated until it transformed from fluid to resin. They had to abandon it under enemy fire. Later, engineers recovered the vehicle and pried open its transmission. Inside, the lubricant had turned to glass, a solid testament to what went wrong when pressure couldn't escape. By contrast, Harris's Cobra II completed a full 112-mile movement without failure. The maintenance officer attached to Combat Command B noted the data with something close to disbelief. In the margins of his logbook, next to the neat columns of figures, he wrote 3 words: "It actually works." That quiet victory, the absence of breakdown, the hum of a gearbox running cool, wasn't just mechanical. It was human. It carried the rhythm of men who had refused to surrender to limitation, who had believed that even steel could be taught to breathe. And somewhere, in the deep hum of Detroit's production line, the memory of that first drilled hole still lingered, in the echo of every hydraulic press, in the faint vibration of conveyor chains. The war had learned to listen to its own heartbeat again. Some nights, long after the plant lights dimmed, you could almost imagine it. The faint sound of a vented gearbox exhaling into the summer air, steady and alive, like a machine remembering how to endure. Temperature differential between standard and vented transmissions under identical load, 41.6 degrees Fahrenheit average reduction. That number, simple, almost dull on paper, spread faster than rumor in a barracks. Within a week, ordnance officers across Tunisia were sending urgent requests for vent retrofits. By March, field depots had stopped waiting for permission. They began drilling their own vents, often with nothing more than a hand tool and faith in field logic. Somewhere in a captured German report from the 10th Panzer's technical staff, an odd note appeared. American tanks appear to maintain mobility even after prolonged pursuit. Their machines do not fail as before. Repair rate improved markedly. In that barren desert where the horizon shimmered like molten glass, even the smallest mechanical advantage became a weapon. A tank that kept moving wasn't just a machine, it was survival on treads. The difference between escape and encirclement often came down to whether the gears could breathe. For nearly 2 years, the Afrika Korps had defined that principle. Rommel's forces had ruled through motion, through the swift geometry of blitzkrieg. But now, at last, the Americans were learning. War correspondents embedded with the 1st Armored Division wrote home of Shermans running day and night, their engines humming with the relentless rhythm of machines that refused to die. They called it American endurance, as if the steel itself had a kind of stubborn soul. Few knew the truth, that behind that newfound stamina wasn't divine design, but a scrap washer and a half-inch vent dreamed up by a red-headed mechanic in a Maryland test shed. After Kasserine, the Ordnance Department compiled its North African Mechanical Endurance Report. No poetry, just numbers, cold and clean. M4, standard gearbox, mean time before failure, 123 operating hours. M4, vented gearbox, 184. Maintenance hours per 100 miles dropped from 14.8 to 7.6. Half the downtime, nearly double the range. To most, those were statistics. To Harris's crew, they were life itself. When fuel ran low near Spiba, they parked their Sherman on a ridge overlooking a graveyard of immobilized armor, American and German alike, hulks scattered across the sand like forgotten monuments. The desert was full of such remains, each one a monument to perfection, undone by heat and time. That night, Harris wrote home by the dim light of a hooded lamp. "This tank breathes. That's the only way I can describe it. Everything else out here chokes in the heat. Ours just keeps breathing." By the end of the campaign, the lesson had carved itself into doctrine. Improvisation had outperformed design. In April 1943, the U.S. Army officially mandated the vent modification across all production Shermans. The order didn't come from a polished boardroom, but from the scorched valleys of Tunisia. The idea born in a Maryland workshop had proven itself immortal. The Sherman no longer merely moved, it endured, and the war, as it always does, whispered its simplest truth. The army that listens to its mechanics will outlast the one that worships its engineers. Washington, D.C., autumn 1943. War had turned the capital into a city of paper. Reports, requisitions, returns, all arriving by the ton, stacked into towers that measured the conflict by the inch. Clerks in rolled sleeves moved through the corridors like ghosts, their typewriters clattering out the rhythm of distant battle. On the 5th floor of the munitions building, Colonel Raymond Staley stood by his window as another convoy of data from North Africa arrived. Onion skin pages, thin enough to see light through, thin enough, as one clerk joked, to glimpse the future. The numbers were clear. Gearbox failures had fallen off a cliff since the introduction of what the paperwork now called the Leroy vent. The column marked mechanical non-combat losses told the story without fanfare. Armored vehicle attrition had dropped 37% in a single quarter. To the Army, that wasn't just maintenance, it was strategy. For every tank that stayed moving, a supply line shortened, an ambush failed, a plan survived. In the early years of combat, almost 1/3 of all M4s lost by U.S. forces hadn't been destroyed by the Wehrmacht or the Luftwaffe. They had simply died on their own, choked by heat and pressure. But after the vent modification, that figure dropped to under 10%. It was a grim measure of progress. Tanks were now surviving long enough to be lost in battle. An internal memorandum, Ordnance Technical Committee Report number 298, put it without ceremony. The improvement of lubrication pressure and thermal stability via vent adaptation constitutes the most significant single refinement to the M4 transmission since production began. The total effect was an estimated 15% increase in operational availability across all theaters, a number that could change the shape of entire campaigns. Credit went officially to the Ordnance Field Maintenance Division, Aberdeen. No individual names. Sergeant Elmer "Red" Leroy, the man who had drilled the first vent by hand, lived only as a ghost in the margins of paperwork. Across the corridor, an analyst from the War Production Board converted the numbers into cost equivalents. Each Sherman cost about $47,000 to build. Every tank saved from mechanical failure was worth 2 fighter planes or 6 jeeps. By mid-1943, over 8,000 Shermans carried the vent modification, representing a savings equivalent to nearly $400 million modern dollars. But money was the least of it. The vent had changed tempo itself. Maintenance crews now spent less time with wrenches and more time with fuel hoses. Tanks stayed on the move, and the front lines began to flow with a new rhythm. Even fuel consumption improved by 3%. A small miracle, but multiplied across an army, it became the pulse of victory. In his end-of-year summary, Colonel Staley wrote a line historians would quote for generations. In industrial war, an idea the size of a drill hole can outweigh a division. That single sentence captured what the Ordnance Corps had been forced to learn. The war's genius wasn't confined to blueprints or laboratories. It lived in evolution, in hands that refused to accept failure. By the end of 1943, the vented transmission had become standard, Ordnance Drawing 413287B. Factories in Detroit, Lima, and pressed steel all complied. Every gearbox carried a small raised letter L near the vent, a mark so discreet most workers never noticed it. To Washington, it was a cost line, $1.17 per tank. For that price, the Sherman had become almost indestructible. And so, stamped into steel and filed into archives, the mechanic's invisible legacy became official doctrine. What had begun as a faint hiss of escaping air in a Maryland shed had become arithmetic proof that adaptability, not perfection, was the soul of American industry. Normandy, France, June 1944. The sea at dawn looked metallic, the same color as the armor waiting to rise from it. The invasion fleet stretched from horizon to horizon, a moving continent of steel. Liberty ships, landing craft, destroyers, and among them the M4 Shermans rode in silence. Salt spray licked their hulls. Beneath layers of paint and armor, each carried the same quiet secret. The vent, the small breath drilled into its gearbox. On D-Day, with down 200 Shermans came ashore with the first and second waves. Correspondents called it the steel tide. What they didn't mention was that the tide kept moving. Tanks that might once have frozen in the surf rolled forward instead, treads clawing through wet sand, engines steady, transmissions humming like deep lungs. Captain Walter Drayton of the 741st Tank Battalion recalled later, "The sea clogged every bearing, salt poured through hatches. We ran hot, but never too hot. I didn't know why until much later." What he described, unknowingly, was the vent, the small grace that let his tank breathe under salt and fire alike. That morning, those machines, once fragile in theory, moved with the patience of living things. Behind the beaches, the 147th Ordnance Maintenance Battalion documented the aftermath. Of 324 operational Shermans, only 19 suffered drivetrain failures that week, under 6%, the lowest mechanical casualty rate in modern warfare. Their preliminary report credited improved venting and lubrication systems introduced the previous year. No signatures, no ceremony, just a line buried in the language of logistics. But in the field, the change was palpable. Crews no longer dreaded the metallic shriek that once signaled failure. The new sound, a steady hum, rhythmic and calm, became the heartbeat of the advancing army. Mechanics noticed that even after 100 miles of combat, the transmission oil stayed clear, the scent of burnt metal replaced by something cleaner, quieter, like warm air leaving a living chest. War photographers captured the Shermans moving inland, churning past hedgerows, engines unceasing. In one frame, near Veerville, a tank named Betsy the Teau bore a small chalk mark on her side, an L. The crew thought it stood for left section. They didn't know it was the factory stamp from Detroit Arsenal, honoring a vent design born from Elmer Leroy's stubborn imagination. That faint letter had traveled from Maryland to Normandy, from scrap metal to liberation. By summer's end, the numbers told their quiet truth again. Ordnance records from the 8th Army Service Command showed a 45% decrease in mechanical downtime compared to 1942. When statisticians traced the origin, they found it not in Detroit or Washington, but in Aberdeen's test logs, in a sergeant's handwritten note describing a washer filed to fit an idea. He found one that still bore its stencil, faded but legible beneath the dust of decades, Aberdeen Test Vehicle Number 8. The vent was there too, exactly where his hands had placed it 3 years earlier. Its brass cap, once sharp-edged and new, had been worn smooth by thousands of hours in motion. He ran his thumb over the metal, feeling the faint warmth of life still hidden in it, and a smile crept quietly across his face. It wasn't pride so much as recognition, like finding an old friend in a crowd. A maintenance officer nearby caught the gesture, clipboard in hand, and stepped closer. "You one of the Aberdeen mechanics?" the officer asked, tipping his head toward the vent. Leroy nodded slightly. "That fix of yours went everywhere," the man continued. "Europe, the Pacific, Italy. They said it saved a lot of tanks. Leroy shrugged, a modest curve of his shoulders. Just made it breathe easier, he murmured. That phrase, made it breathe easier, would later find its way into the U.S. Army Ordnance Review, 1947, in a quiet article summarizing wartime mechanical innovations. The anonymous author credited field ingenuity by ordnance personnel for pioneering transmission pressure venting. It was the only formal mention of Leroy's work, a single line among hundreds, but by then the legend had already outpaced the record. Mechanics passed down the tale of the Aberdeen Fix, a field improvisation that turned the Sherman into something almost pastoral in its dependability, as steady as a farm tractor. Veterans swore by it. In post-war maintenance schools, instructors used it as an example of initiative, how necessity could give birth to doctrine. The Army's Technical Service School Manual, TM9 731A, 1946, included a neat diagram of the vented gearbox. Under Design Origin, a simple note. Modification developed from Field Report, Aberdeen, 1942. No signature, no citation. Just a placeholder for an idea whose name no longer mattered. And Leroy, true to form, didn't seem to mind. After discharge, he returned to Pennsylvania, a state of mills, smoke, and long shifts that stretched from whistle to whistle. He took a job at a steel plant near Pittsburgh. The heat there was a different kind of war, but one he understood. He never patented the vent, never wrote about it. When asked about his service, he'd only say, "I fixed what was noisy." Yet others remembered. In 1962, at the U.S. Japanese Aviation and Armor Symposium in Tokyo, Colonel Harold Winslow, once a young engineer who'd first read Leroy's field report in Detroit, ended his speech on wartime innovation with a quiet story. "There was a man," he said, "who drilled a hole in a gearbox without permission. That hole saved more tanks than any general ever commanded." The room, filled with former allies and former enemies, fell silent for a breath, then erupted in applause. No one knew the mechanic's name, but the story had already grown larger than the man himself. Years later, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Pacific Theater, Volume 12, Armor and Motor Transport, would confirm what had long been whispered. Between 1943 and 1945, the operational availability of Sherman tanks across all theaters rose from 62% to 83%. Mechanical losses fell below 10%, unmatched by any other armored vehicle of the war. Historians tracing the curve of that improvement always arrived at a single point, the spring of 1943, when the vent modification became standard issue. Even the Soviets took notice. In their Lend-Lease reports filed through Murmansk, maintenance officers praised the American M4's gearbox for its superior pressure relief. Translated notes described it as resistant to heat, stable under continuous operation. They quietly copied the vent into their own domestic designs. By the 1950s, the Leroy vent had influenced every major tank design, from the Pershing to the Patton. The principle became so fundamental that technical drafts no longer mentioned it. Gear housings simply breathed by design, as though they always had. What once violated regulation had become engineering law. When the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History restored a Sherman for exhibition in 1965, curators found the vent during disassembly. One of them, a soft-spoken man with a pen tucked behind his ear, made a small note in the restoration log. Gearbox includes unique wartime modification. Purpose unclear, likely field engineered. They photographed it, labeled it Aberdeen Field Vent, and reassembled the tank. That photograph still rests in the museum's archives under Mechanical Adaptations, World War II. The man who made it, however, was already gone. Elmer Red Loy died in 1959, just 48 years old from lung disease, working man's death. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Press mentioned only that he had been a wartime mechanic and later a foreman at U.S. Steel. No medals, no citations, no hint of the small invention that had quietly traveled the world. And yet, his legacy didn't need ceremony. It lived not through recognition but through function. Each time a tank transmission turned without seizing, each time a machine breathed instead of choking, his ghost moved unseen through the rhythm of its gears. Historians later wrote that the Sherman's reliability, its uncanny ability to be there whenever and wherever it was needed, was as decisive a factor in victory as any bomb or gun. Behind that reliability lay something human, a man who listened. He had heard a gearbox complain, a machine's metallic protest against its own design, and he chose not to ignore it. That was all. At Fort Knox, long after his visit, The old Shermans were retired to the training fields. Their names faded, their armor rusted beneath the Kentucky sun. Yet when mechanics started one up for a demonstration, the sound that rose from its belly, the deep hum, steady and unbroken, became his memorial. The whine in the gearbox was gone, and that silence, that steady, earned silence, had crossed oceans, carried divisions, and outlasted empires. The war had been fought with courage, calculation, and with small acts of rebellion, shortcuts born not of carelessness, but of care. Among those countless gestures, Elmer Loy's vent remained the quietest and perhaps the most enduring. It was the sound of a nation learning that progress sometimes begins when one man decides the rules are wrong. Under the same Kentucky sky, the tanks still stood, metal warm to the touch, engines long since stilled. Inside, each rested that same small vent, perfectly drilled, perfectly placed, a bridge between instinct and industry, between one man's listening ear and the vast machinery of democracy. In the official histories, it was merely a lubrication improvement. In soldiers' slang, they called it luck. But in truth, it was neither. It was a simple act that worked, and kept working long after the war had forgotten the name of the man who made it. Somewhere, across the parade ground, a breeze stirred the grass. The empty hulls caught the light just so, and for a fleeting instant, the rows of silent Shermans seemed to exhale, as if the machines themselves still remembered how to breathe. Elmer Leroy never saw France. By then he was back in Aberdeen, teaching younger mechanics bound for the Pacific. His name appeared in no headlines, but his work lived in every Sherman that rolled through Europe, every tank that refused to stop. The noise of war had long since grown too vast for any single voice to stand out. Yet beneath that noise ran an echo, the steady hum of a vented gearbox, turning freely, a tank breathing calmly beneath armor thick with history. And in that sound lived the war's quiet. Truth, sometimes victory begins not with an order, but with a single mechanic listening to what the machine is trying to say. Fort Knox, Kentucky, autumn 1945. The war had ended, leaving its instruments behind. The tanks that once thundered across continents now stood silent, aligned in rows across the proving ground, gleaming dully under the southern sun. Their engines were cold, their paint had lost its shine. Yet their shapes still carried the memory of motion, the echo of storms they had survived. Inside each one, whether it had crossed the Rhine or the dunes of Tunisia, lay a small vent, half an inch wide, threaded in brass. The Army called it the Leroy Vent Modification Standard. Few remembered what the name meant. Fewer still knew there had been a man called Elmer "Red" Leroy at all. He arrived at Fort Knox that September, newly discharged after 3 years of ordnance service. His once bright hair had dulled, stained by oil and time. His uniform smelled faintly of graphite and steel. He walked the tank rows like a man visiting old friends. The Shermans loomed above him, their hatches open, the scent of aged lubricant and rust drifting in the warm air. He paused beside one, resting his hand on the armor plate, feeling, perhaps, for a heartbeat still hidden within the steel. Somewhere deep inside, under layers of iron and memory, the gearbox gave a faint metallic sigh as if exhaling one last breath.